These offerings are born out of an intention to share and bookmark ideas. After coming across different information and making connections between seemingly random things, I wanted to record the synchronicities I was picking up on between all of these elements. This 1159 zine series is an effort to preserve that essence of magic in this trail of ideas and intuitions, knowing that it's almost midnight, time is almost up, and that things are not going to be as they are now or once were. Putting things that speak to one another into ciphers and recording them in these publications. The purpose of this is to present threads of information that ultimately weave together a bigger picture and to see what was speaking out to me through my work. To spread awareness, eradicate misconcepts, and place them in their proper perspectives, to inspire conversation, build networks and community, as well as share insights and creative works directly from the collaborators. Each volume of 1159 is loosely inspired by a season. 1159 Volume 2 is the spring season wrap-up. To give an idea of the feeling behind this installment, here are some words. The mercurial nature of birds and bees as information bearers, travelers, and vibration creators. Honey and sweet treats after patience and diligence. A heavy emphasis on all forms of community, fecundity, growth, and tending to the land in the face of death, detriment, and opposition. Coming together to feed one another and refreshing of the soul, even in the midst of turmoil and dark moments. Art at a large scale, murals, conversation, blossoming, newness, and always love. Each volume of 1159 has some type of saying or title to go with it. The title of 1159 Volume 2 is Those Who Seek Shall Find. So now that you have a vibe of what was behind the making of this, let's go through the book and talk more specifically about each page, also touching on some inspirations that didn't make it into the pages explicitly. The cover is an image that I first drew in 2015. It was inspired by a mural that was done by Diego Rivera called La Tierra Fecunda, or the Fecund Land, done in the 1920s at Chapingo Autonomous University. The mural features his then wife, Guadalupe Marin, who was pregnant. Yes, he was married before and after Frida Kahlo. What speaks to you in this mural? For me, there are different elements that stand out, like the baby's head blowing air, the positioning of the woman's hands in a giving or receiving mode, elements of the woman and her body being synonymous with the land, shapes, curves, roundness, our relationship with the give and take of resources, life cycles, and environment, what's seen and not seen, and the elements air, fire, earth, and water. I found out about this image in a Mesoamerican history class, learning about the Mexican Muralist Movement around the Mexican Revolution in the early 1900s. There are three prominent figures from this movement that I learned about: Diego Rivera, David Alfaro Siqueiros, and Jose Clemente Orozco. This muralist movement could be a whole class in itself, but main points that stood out to me included this element of art for the people and art as the cultivation of political ideologies that activated marginalized groups of people. This type of muralistic art turns the notion of art for art's sake on its head. Art for art's sake comes from a French slogan around the early 19th century that basically says the intrinsic value of art and the only true art is divorced from any moral, political, or utilitarian function, which I think is kind of hard to do because even the circumstances under which individuals are able to create art today is political to some degree. So I don't really see how, I understand where they're coming from, but I don't really see how art for art's sake is anything of value. You can make art just to make it, but the conditions under which we live are political. So I think that's interesting. What do y'all think? Is art for art's sake applicable? Is that really a thing? Like just doing art for the sake of doing art and there's no other ties of political, social, economic, moral, didactic, or any other things attached to it and it just exists in a vacuum and we're just making things for the sake of making them? Or is everything kind of tied into some type of politics? What do you think? This muralist movement had a strong emphasis on the people and the community, so it definitely was not art for art's sake. It was about art inspiring action and being accessible to everyone, not art being collected or privatized, but it was being put up on the walls of public buildings where everybody can see it or a lot of people had access to it. Having these huge scales is something that I was also interested in. Artwork at a large scale, which is very technical to accomplish, and what it took to make art at this scale, and why they chose to make these grand scale artworks with these political statements behind them. What were they trying to affect by making art in this way? And looking at what was going on socially and politically during the Mexican Revolution, before and after that, seeing exactly why they chose to do this and why this movement developed in the way that it did. After learning about that and that being impressed upon me, I was just wondering how and what things we can learn from this movement and if anything from that movement is applicable today, as far as community, as far as inspiring action and ideologies through art on a grand scale, as far as activating groups of marginalized people and empowering them and giving them something, a common ideal to move on. When I learned about this movement and learned about the environment and the social political framework that this movement developed out of, it was like looking back in time and noticing that there's a bunch of people who've already done the work and there's people's shoulders that we're standing on and they have already put in a lot of work. So it's kind of like there's batons that have been passed on to us, and so now we must also push forward on what they already started. And just knowing that somebody already else started something before you and gave you a push forward, it makes it, for me, it makes it more empowering, more invigorating. It makes me more excited and ready and charged up that there's already a network of things for me to build on and continue. I'm not doing this alone. I'm not starting something from zero. This is already a thing. So, making another connection, I think it's interesting to look at the residual effects of these impressions over time. So, the impressions that this Mexican muralist movement had over time and how it echoes far into the future. It came apparent to me once I found out about Robert Blackburn, who was a more contemporary artist. He was a master printmaker, and in his youth, he seems to have been inspired by the work and ideology of the Mexican muralist movement. Here's a clip where in this video they talk all about Robert Blackburn, where I advise you should check this video out. But they show some works that directly show his inspiration from this Mexican muralist movement. And I think it's really interesting because not only was the artwork maybe inspired by the movement, but also Robert Blackburn and his practice has shown to be inspired by these themes of community building and people from different groups and backgrounds and classes being able to come together, help one another, share resources and ideas, and get things done, complete things, put things out into the world, and also really have a real sense of community and make a space for marginalized people where there wasn't any space before that was actually respected. I think he's one of the main pioneers, or at least in my mind, that made that happen, that made that a real thing. And it's just interesting to see these little threads of inspiration that connect and how they play out into the future. So Robert Blackburn's legacy is very much about building and making community and having a bunch of different people from different backgrounds coming together for a common purpose. And so we can see those echoes from the Mexican Muralist Movement into today and going forward. On a technical aspect of mural making, I found it interesting that Rivera was studied in the traditional art teachings that employ things like the golden ratio and trompe-l'œil. Trompe-l'œil is an art technique that creates an optical illusion that makes it look like the two-dimensional art is actually 3D. So you can see that example in this work here, where he drew men on scaffolds. This is done on a two-dimensional plane that he painted this on, but it actually looks like it's in real life. It doesn't look like this is men painted on a wall. It looks like I'm actually looking at men on scaffolds. And that's the trompe-l'œil technique. I think that just adds another layer to the mechanics or the technical side of mural making. There was another tool that he used, which a lot of artists and people in general use, which is employing that golden mean ratio. Just to give a brief overview, this is a good article to reference. It speaks about geometric proportions and the ways they serve as design tools. And this article speaks about how specifically within Islamic art, these geometric proportions are applied with high accuracy and great precision. So it goes on to talk about geometry being the visual means by which we comprehend the order and the harmony inherent in creation as a whole. And these geometric proportions are the visual representation of the mathematical patterns found everywhere in man, nature, and the cosmos. So this golden mean ratio can be found everywhere as well. People use it for design, but it also occurs naturally in nature. And so that's why there's this idea that these geometric proportions are the most beautiful naturally. Definitely check this out for more on the golden mean ratio and how it's employed. Another part of this zine includes an interview with an Atlanta native and elder, J.R. Murphy. This interview was done in conjunction with a video tour of an urban farm that he was helping run at the time. You can watch that video on YouTube. Just search beekeeping and urban farming with J.R. Murphy and maybe type in purpose after that to make sure you get the right video. In the written interview we did, he speaks about what it was like growing up during the 1950s and 60s and how he got into beekeeping. You can see from the video that he's a no-nonsense type, but at the same time, he's so lighthearted and so upbeat. Getting insight into his life and thoughts and meeting him had me start relating in my mind his story to the Bacchic, Dionysian, Osirian dramas. Now, these esoteric stories talk about the concept of divinity, rationality, or the spirit coming down into the material, irrational world and being split up into a bunch of pieces, and how we can connect back with Source, even in the midst of this sense of irrationality and chaos. Mr. Murphy spoke a lot about things like death, chaos, irrationality, oppression, and genocide, especially during his youth and schooling years. He lived in a housing project and referred to it as a concentration camp. He also touched on racial prejudices he faced in school amongst classmates. Even further, he said something interesting, which I heard Bobby Hemmett also say. He said, "We were poor, but we didn't even realize we were poor until we went to school or college," which I think is a really interesting concept within itself. Like, a lot of times they throw this label on marginalized people. They're poor, they're illiterate, and especially people who are native to the land or who are from the land, who are born on the land, whose parents and their parents was born on the land that they live and they know about this place. A lot of times it's always said that these people are poor or they're downtrodden or they're lowly. And that just made me question, like, our whole concept of what poverty is, because if he didn't know he was poor and other people didn't know they were poor, but the state or some media situation is saying that they're poor, it makes a point to be careful with what labels that you adopt that other people put on you. So even though we were in marginalized situations, the way our families, a lot of our families were, we were never going without. We still were taken care of, and we still had a sense of community, and still had a sense of family. We still learned things. We were still able to read, and even if it wasn't English, or even if it wasn't in a specific way, there are indigenous languages, there are idiosyncratic languages, there are things that we are very knowledgeable in. We have cultural capital, for sure. We have social capital in a lot of ways. So just because people don't fit into this mainstream idea of what success and intelligence and wealth is, does not mean that you are poor, marginalized, downtrodden, or lacking in any way. So yeah, he said we were poor, but we didn't even realize we were poor until we went to school. So until they compared it to somebody else, or until they saw what somebody else outside of their community might have, or with somebody outside of their community, how they might do things, they didn't even know. So that's also the power of comparison. You don't know what you have until you really compare it to something else or to not having that. So I thought that was interesting too. Mr. Murphy reveres his mother, mentioning how she cooked, cleaned, took care of the home, worked, healed others, and cooked the best desserts on top of all that. So a lot of times it's these caregivers, our parents, mothers, grandmothers, fathers, aunts, uncles, who really make life sweet for us. And we don't even realize that we're in a so-called bad position. So shout out to all those people who hold it down regardless. And we're wealthy in our own true way. Don't get distracted. So even his dealing with bees, the patience and precision and wisdom that takes, the challenge of it that is rewarded with something sweet like honey, can be an example, and can also speak to those same esoteric stories that mention mead and honey, bees and pleasure. He is an example of making your own sweetness out of life, regardless of the chaotic circumstances we see around us. Remembering the quality of the cloth from which you come from helps transcend us out of this mundane life. So, like bees, how are we defying the mundane laws of gravity? How are we going to go against all odds? All of these different parts are scattered down here in this illusion. How are we going to gather all these parts, make sense of them, and transcend it all? Is it a logical process? Like, oh, I have to go pick up each of these pieces and bring them back together. Or can we tap into some divine magical force that just kind of brings it all together for us? Or is it a balance of two? Do we need to work hand in hand with the logical aspect on one side of mapping the scattered pieces, finding a course to take, that matched on the other side with that divinity, that remembering, that knowledge of who we are and the source from which we come from? Tapping into that and remembering in order to magnetize all the pieces to you, so you're not taxing yourself, scoring the globe, trying to find pieces of yourself when you can magnetize all those pieces to you when you remember who you really are. Another important takeaway from this is that people are treasure chests unto themselves, and we have to tap into one another. And I think it's important to record what people say. I think we should speak more often to our elders and ask them questions, ask them how things were, ask their opinions, ask them about their mistakes and their triumphs. These are part of our oracles. So, back to the cover title. Those who seek shall find. This is a saying that really just came to me. It just popped up in my head. I heard, those who seek shall find. I knew it was a familiar phrase, but I just didn't know exactly where I heard it from. So I decided to use that as the title for this book. But as I kept working on this, putting this together, other things about this saying revealed itself to me. It resonated with me, and I started to move with this saying. A few weeks later, I watched a video from the Gnosis on YouTube, and he mentioned the Gospel of Thomas, which offers the reader Jesus' secret teachings about the kingdom of God. So the Gospel of Thomas is really like a bunch of Jesus' parables. This was the direct quote that the Gnosis shared from a book called The Other Bible by Willis Bornstone. It says, let him who seeks continue seeking until he finds. When he finds, he will become troubled. And when he becomes troubled, he will be astonished, and he will rule over all. I never heard that saying expanded like that before. For me, when I just heard it as those who seek shall find, I thought of whenever you're interested in something or you're gravitating towards an idea or you want to accomplish something or meet somebody, whatever you're trying to manifest in your life, when you go after it and put that intention to seek it, you will find it. When the student is ready, the teacher comes, something kind of like that. What was interesting when I heard this quote expanded and where it really came from, let him who seeks continue seeking until he finds. Okay, boom, I stopped there. But then it says, when he finds, he will become troubled. And I thought that was interesting because it's like when you find what you're looking for, not that it's never enough, but there's always something more, something that may bother you or agitate you, something more you have to look and think about and ponder on or work at. Like it's never just, oh, I found it, boom, got it. Like it's always something else. And even with information, when you want to know why is this like this? Why is it this way? Or what's this about? And then you look into it, you find that information, and it's kind of like a never ending rabbit hole. It goes and goes, and you find all these different connections, but he will become troubled. Trouble. Troubled? Like, when he becomes troubled, he will be astonished and he will rule over all. So maybe after someone does all this work to seek and find, then they find, and then there's all these other remnants coming off of it. When you go into that, it's like you're becoming troubled. Everything is so much. And then when you become troubled, you will become astonished. Let me just see what the etymology of astonished is. To stun, strike senseless, daze, deafen, astound, to thunder out. So to have someone thunderstruck, amaze, to shock with wonder, so that kind of gives this feeling of enlightened or like pushing light out, right? So after you're troubled and agitated and you work on that grain of sand that keeps bothering you and all these different connections, then there becomes a moment where I feel like you just realize and you come to know. Not by reading all these different things, but just coming inside yourself. And that's that light, that astonishment, that thunder that's coming out now because you've done the work or you have went inside and now the thunder is coming out. And after you become astonished, you will rule over all. Hmm, that's really interesting to me. Moving on, in the zine, there's also a spread I did about a drink called Rooh Afza, and I explained how I found out about the drink and why it's significant to me, and again, just how a bunch of these different synchronicities brought me to finding out more about this drink and finally trying it. But it really all started from reading a book by Ishmael Reed. It was actually an anthology that he compiled called Powwow, Charting the Fault Lines in the American Experience. So it's just a bunch of stories that he put together and created this book. In this book, there's a short story by Wajahat Ali called Ramadan Blues about a young boy who loves food and his first Ramadan. The story does a good job laying out a few of the idiosyncrasies of Islam and fasting and Ramadan. It put me on to new phrases and things, but really just seeing that when people celebrate things religiously, a lot of times they all relate the same way across cultures. A lot of times we're doing the same things in a little bit different ways, but across all things, I just see this thread, trying to look for the similarities through things instead of trying to be so opposed and see why everything is different, but also having that balance of appreciating the differences, but realizing like we all here though. So through my research into the drink Rooh Afza, which is mentioned in the story by Wajahat Ali, I was able to talk with Sham-E Ali about her relationship to and knowledge of this drink. Shami Ali is a multidisciplinary artist, a poet, a writer from the greater Philadelphia area. She gave me a bunch of insight and personal history of this sweet drink. Then I went into the history of the man and the land from which Rooh Afza was created. Hakim Hafiz Abdul Majid created this drink in Old Delhi during the early 1900s. But the land we know today as India results from the partitioning of the lands previously known as Hindustan. Under British occupation, Cyril Radcliffe, who had never even been to these lands before, created the artificial borders that split West Pakistan, India, and East Pakistan in 1947. This affected not only the Majid family business, but everyone and was detrimental on all fronts. Most times, borders are drawn over areas that are already culturally and geographically cohesive, tearing that affinity right apart. Imagine living up the block from your cousin, and then after the partitioning, no one has moved anywhere, but you're now in two separate countries. And on top of that, restrictions are placed on who and how you can travel between countries, if at all. I go more in depth about this in the zine, but this is just the surface of the topic of borders, lands, and identities, which can also be a whole course unto itself. I think an important takeaway is to ask ourselves what borders have been drawn and imposed not just on our ancestral lands, but in our everyday lives. How do we respond to borders? How can we defy borders? Can we create our own borders? Are borders necessary? What happens to the people right on the borders or those who live between them? So, this is what I love. I wouldn't have known that reading a short story about Ramadan would bring me to investigating British settler colonialism in Hindustan. And all the pieces I'm picking up along the way are coming together to make this larger picture. So, this is the wrap up of all my findings during the spring 2021 season. Hopefully, this video is a good complement to the zine and giving a background to the insights into the making of it. Thank you for everyone who's tuning in. Right now, you can still purchase 1159 Zine Volume 2 at niameanspurpose.org. I'm always open to questions or comments, and this is going to move into a more discussion and forum based thing. But for now, thank you, everyone. Peace.